And good afternoon. Welcome to our eCafe. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. We have a number of folks who've registered for the event today, so we're really excited to jump right in just a moment. We have 9 folks who are currently here. We're expecting about 20 and some, so perhaps we'll give them just another minute, if that's okay with everyone, before we launch in. For folks who are joining, perhaps for now, if you can mute your microphones and turn your cameras off, but we will be having a highly interactive presentation today. So we encourage folks to, at the appropriate time, jump in with comments and questions and feedback with our presenter aujourd'hui today.
And before we begin, if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, where you're tuning in from, that would be great as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for that. Well, so I'll start off and perhaps from our side, give a quick introduction before we introduce our guest today. So I'm Scott Isbrandt. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Enrich Education Alliance. Let me pass to my colleague, Nicole.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Carney. I'm the Director of Engagement at the Enrich Education Alliance, and happy for all of you to join.
So with no further ado, I think we should just jump right in. Welcome to our eCafe series. So for those of you who have attended before, it's a very informal event. You can see that we're offering everyone free e-donuts. There's no limit. Have as many as you want. They're on the screen. Tony, if he was here, I'm sure he would offer eCafe and other sundry items, but he is not and sends his regrets. So at any rate, welcome. We're really pleased to have Dr. Junaid Mubin today with us, who's going to talk a bit about the work that Whizz Education does, and we're really happy to have him with us. And again, I think you'll find that we want to keep this presentation highly interactive and kind of zoom in on some of the key issues. But of course, also interested to hear what are interesting for folks to hear. So, again, looking at Whizz Education, Junaid, you guys are doing wonderful work, enabling communities around the world, focusing in on impact and individualized learning throughout this period of COVID, which, even before COVID was incredibly challenging. But we're really fortunate to have you here today. And, without further ado, I want to hand over to you, and we'd love to hear more about your work.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks for the invitation too. This is the first time I've tried an event like this, and we're going to try, as Scott said, to keep it as informal and dialogical as possible. We were just reflecting just before you all joined us how important it is that we practice what we preach, and so if we're here to discuss any aspect of the future of education and what the future of learning and teaching looks like, it feels like that should be reflected in our format. So rest assured, I'm not going to spend the next hour lecturing to you. That's the last thing on my mind. I do have some slides. I hope you'll find some of them interesting. But I'd actually like to start just by hearing from you. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to go to, I'm going to go over here. I'll come back to the slides in a moment. But if you could just grab any device, and your computer will do, just go to any device that has a browser. And if you go to menti.com, that's menti.com, it's a polling app. And the first question I have is really very simple, and it will hopefully anchor us to some key talking points. So what would you like to get from the next hour? I'd quite like to leave this session feeling like I've actually sort of satisfied the intent of your attendance. So this conversation will go in whatever direction you need it to. So just go to menti.com. It'll ask you for a code, and it's up there on the screen. It's 44129, and then you should see this question pop up. So what would you like to get from the next hour? Maybe 1 or 2 sentences, and your answer should start popping up on the screen. It'll just be interesting to see where people are coming from. So I'm getting a sense of your background on the chat, so thank you for sharing there. But how should we spend our time together in the next hour or so? What's really sort of pressing on your mind? Maybe there's something in the title of this forum that's grabbed your attention. And I do have a few things that I'm hoping to talk about, but really I want this to be as much of a conversation as possible. So I'll give you another minute or two to put in your responses, and hopefully they'll start popping up. More info on Whizz. Rest assured, there'll be plenty of that, although hopefully not too much. Lovely. So the responses are popping up. Yeah, I think we're in a good place, because I will introduce myself properly in a moment, and some of the work that I do, and Whizz is very much at the forefront of that. I'm also going to talk about a couple of other projects as well, and I really hope you do feel like there is sort of practical intent to this session, and that it's not all just theory. So I hope you will have some practical ideas to take away. I'll certainly talk about individualized learning. You'll see why I think it's so powerful, and particularly as a way of navigating these very choppy waters that we're in. And best practices that have served as well. I'll talk through some of those, and indeed some of the challenges as well. So if you've not yet submitted your response, please do so. I'll find them eventually anyway. But I thought I should just give some quick background then, and since a few of you have mentioned Whizz, hopefully you can see the slides. And I'll just go to full screen. So there's actually 3 projects that I'm working on that I'd like to discuss with you today. They're all centered on math education. Sometimes I'll say math, sometimes I'll pluralize and say maths. I can't guarantee consistency either way. But my main day-to-day work is at Whizz Education. And so we are an education partner accountable to learning outcomes, and we've developed a virtual tutoring platform called Whizz, and it really has individualized learning at the core. The idea behind this virtual tutoring platform is it's not a person at the other end of Zoom. It's an actual online AI-enabled platform that uses clever algorithms and rich content to help students work through a maths curriculum at their individual pace. And so we've worked with parents and schools and ministries, states, all across the world. We've delivered virtual tutoring to almost 2 million students now. And we have some interesting projects dotted around the globe. So I'm calling you from the UK. We have around 25 to 30,000 students in the UK on Whizz today. Similar numbers over in the US. Our largest scale projects have been in places like Russia, where there was a point in time where Whizz was in every primary school in Russia. And at the moment, we support primary and early secondary. Our content goes up towards around the end of 8th grade. In the international development space, we have 2 large-scale projects of real note. The first is Project Imalango, that serves rural communities in Kenya. And we've recently rolled out a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can imagine that with all the disruptions due to COVID, and not actually just due to COVID, because some of these contexts have actually dealt with pandemics even prior to that. So the DRC project, for example, was beset by challenges due to the second wave of Ebola that they were facing. So what we found interesting is just to see an alignment of challenges between all these different environments. There was a time where perhaps there was a partition between the kind of work that we do in places like rural Kenya and DRC, where we have these major infrastructural challenges, and places like the UK and the US, where in the normal circumstances, you can take things for granted. The idea of students having access to internet-able devices, that's not something we ever really had to worry about at scale in the UK and US. And of course, that's all changed in the last year. So COVID has really kind of galvanized our efforts all across the globe, and has brought a kind of uniformity to the way that we're thinking about some of those challenges. So I'll say a bit more about some of the data that we're seeing at Whizz from our platform, and some of the implications we think that has a bit later. But I do want to talk about 2 other projects that I'm working on as well, because I think they all speak to the same underlying theme. So I run something called the Oxford Maths Club. I lived in Oxford for many years, and initially it was an in-person maths club. And about a year ago, for obvious reasons, it went online. And initially it was an experiment, much like these eCafes. It was just me teaching a few students over Zoom. And it has sort of slowly gained traction since then. And the Oxford Maths Club is my opportunity to really kind of bring out my inner mathematician. So I was a mathematician by training. I now work in education. And Whizz Education really kind of addresses a core need in education, which is making sure that students have access to core knowledge and skills. And the Oxford Maths Club is then an opportunity to kind of venture a bit further, to ask what kind of mathematics do students really need in the 21st century that may even sit outside of the formal curriculum. And so that's been a real kind of experimental ground for me to trial different courses, to engage students in different ways. And so I'd like to expose you to some of the things that we're doing, and more than that, actually get some of your thoughts and perspectives on what mathematics education needs to look like. And just to kind of top things off, I am writing a book at the moment called Mathematical Intelligence, which is really rooted in this question of what education, and particularly mathematics, needs to look like in the age of artificial intelligence, and the fact that technology is now evolving at a rate of accelerating returns, and behooves us as educators to kind of question the very tenets of our education system all the way down to the curriculum. So these projects lead me to a number of challenges and a number of questions. And it feels like if we're not going to ask these questions now, during COVID, when we have widespread disruption, if we're not going to question now the purpose of education and to take this as an opportunity to examine our assumptions, well, if not now, then when? And there's just one chart that I want to show you. This is something we came across a month or two ago. This was from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. I think there's a bit of a lag, but it's not that one, it's that one. So you may have seen this already. This is a system level view of what the recovery period looks like for education systems globally. And I guess all of these models are fairly crude, but I think there is a key takeaway here, which is very basically that the system leaders that do not act proactively and just kind of resume with status quo models of schooling can expect to recover the damage and lost learning that's being incurred by COVID over an 8-year time span. That's a whole generation of lost learning. Those system leaders that are more proactive, that implement targeted intervention strategies and catch-up programs, can expect to halve that period to 4 years. Now, I don't think you need to subscribe to the exact numbers here. I think the overarching takeaway there is just the cost of inaction. And while this is kind of pitted at the level of entire education systems, I think this affects us as individuals. So I speak to you as a mathematician, but also as an educator, and also as a parent. I have a 2-year-old, and I'm starting to really now think, what are the impacts of COVID going to be on her? What if this lingers on for a few years? What if we're hit with other disruptions? It's fairly grim thoughts, but you have to entertain those ideas as educators and as parents. And so there's certainly a feeling that we really need to take charge of our own destiny, and that the status quo, our usual norms and assumptions around schooling and learning and teaching, really need to come under scrutiny. So this is where I'd really love to hear from you, because I've listed a few things, maybe slightly presumptively. And I can see one more comment came in around remote teaching, and I hope we'll certainly get into some of that as well. This conversation can go in a number of different directions, because I think we have a plurality of challenges right now, and I've listed 4 of them. And they're obviously interconnected and dependent on one another, but I'd like you to indulge me for a moment. If you had to rank them in order, what would your priorities be for education? And you can come at it from the point of view as a parent or an educator, a system leader, a policymaker, whatever hats you happen to wear. Where do you think our focus should be? Because the realities are we're constrained by limited time and budget. We can't necessarily do all of these things very well. They're competing for attention and resources. What comes to your mind as our foremost priority? So back to menti.com, the code is the same as before, 44129, and I should just ask you to rank these in order, and we should start seeing these moving around as your responses come in. And just while you're doing that, I'm just going to look at the chat, and I can see a question's come up around connectivity. I mean, the truth is it's very difficult, and it's difficult even here in the UK. In the UK, we had in the early stages of the pandemic, it was quite widely documented that we had 1.8 million children, 1.8 million, who did not have access to internet-enabled devices. And so when schools were closed, they had no means of continuing their learning in any kind of structured way. Unfortunately, here we are a year later, and there's still over 500,000 students, well over 500,000 students who are still in that position. The truth is that in contexts like the DRC, our only hope of getting, certainly the communities that we work in, the only hope of getting those students online is through school networks. So there have been periods of activity where schools have opened up for intermittent periods, and we've just had to have a relentless focus on making sure that we're able to maximize the potential of their time online there. I think sometimes there's a misconception that you'll often hear that, that Africa has kind of leapfrogged the rest of the world, and that they're all on smartphones ready to take advantage of the latest technology. That certainly doesn't bear out in some of the communities that we work in. So they're still very reliant on schools and the infrastructure that's provided to them as part of the projects that we're involved in to get online. So it is an enduring challenge. We feel very positive about those bursts of activity, those pockets of success that we've had in those periods, but we are really at the mercy of social distancing and public health measures at the moment.
I just wanted to jump in, Junaid, and also just say to our participants in the eCafe, this is a very interactive, informal setting. So, where appropriate, feel free to turn on your cameras. Comment in the chat, by all means, Menti, while you're voting. But also, if you wanted to ask a direct question or contribute a comment, feel free to turn on your camera or raise your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think now's actually a great jumping point. I feel like I have spoken too much in the opening session, but now that I've got some of your responses, it'd be great to hear from anyone to just advocate for what you put top of your list. It seems like it's a fairly close run thing between ensuring access and ensuring mental well-being. Jason, please go ahead. You might need to unmute yourself, Jason. Probably the most buzzword of 2020.
It's useful if one's going to try and speak. Yes. Hi. Thank you. It's a very good area to be discussing. I'm glad to hear from you. I'm in Cambridge, the other place,
Yes.
not Oxford. I'm interested because a lot of the work we're dealing with is looking at these kinds of things, but a lot of it is about the mechanics, about sort of the teaching and how to get the teachers in schools when schools are closed, in countries across Africa and so on, how we can help the teachers to deliver something remotely, and kids who are maybe not even in school, they could be at home, what media can be used to get there, and how do we actually, I think there's been a big rush under the COVID last year, people sort of putting out programs, sending materials, putting stuff on websites, radio programs and so on, and then a sort of lull and people thinking, well, we don't actually know if kids are learning anything. So that's right. Even just about access and delivery before we get onto these questions of quality of learning and so on. And I'm interested to see that the access to online learning is right at the top, because to me, I come from a distance learning background over many years. To me, that seems a key thing, whether it's internet access or radio or print or whatever, but it's a mechanism for getting there. It's not an end purpose in itself. I think that things like the fundamentals of mental well-being and keeping engaged are even fundamentals before we get to catching up with lost learning and so on. And I think a lot of people from International Network for Education Emergencies, for example, are saying in a lot of countries, strip down the curriculum, don't be ambitious, don't try and do innovative, enhanced, more forward-looking learning like you introduced about what kind of maths is needed for the 21st century. That's important. But even clinging on to the basics is quite important. So there's a lot of tensions in there. Just before since I've got the floor, just before I shut up, I'm interested because in that other sort of category about enriching the quality of maths teaching and learning and overcoming the hurdles which around the world, including in UK, in my own experience, a lot of people have barriers to mathematics learning built in almost systemically and traditionally. There are two projects that I've heard of that I think are quite interesting. One is in South Africa called Winning Teams, which is based on saying, look, kids are not learning so much in the classroom. We can have some outer school maths learning clubs where they build on games and cooperation. And they're doing some work with us in Sierra Leone for that, and so on and so forth. Another thing is there's a project in Cambridge called Enrich Maths, which is run for a load of mathematicians, Charlie Gilderdale and so on. And I think that's quite interesting, a lot of resources to try and help teachers around the world, but not an emergency response. So that's my tuppence worth.
Well, thank you so much. There's so many wonderful things you left me with there, so much to unpack. And Enrich is actually going to be mentioned on one of the later slides, so I'll just kind of tee that up. Would anyone else like to come in for now before I try to respond to some of those points? Anyone else? Well, let me try to address a couple of them, and please do keep your comments coming on the chat. Do raise your hand if you want to come in at any point. It'll be great to hear from you. So a number of prompts there. So one of the things I took away there was the importance of really empowering teachers, and not assuming that technology is a silver bullet of any kind, which is an all too tempting assumption that often pervades EdTech and explains much of its checkered history. And I think what we've seen in the last year, and I guess you can interpret it in different ways, we've seen an onslaught of new content, new tools that have been quickly sort of hashed together as a way of trying to support teachers and students and giving them some hope of stability and preserving continuity in their students' learning. I would say it's all very well intended, but it doesn't necessarily shift the pedagogy, and quite often it can actually have unintended consequences. So I'm sure we've all suffered from Zoom fatigue by now. Maybe you're suffering from it already 20 minutes in, but how many of us can really get through 2 or 3 hours of Zoom meetings a day before we really need to take a break? And it feels to me like the technology, the pace of development of technology outstrips our ability to really examine it. And so when I see that there's this assumption that students are going to spend hours each day online in these kinds of settings, while it feels very intuitive, I worry that there will be unintended consequences. And I think we need to be able to distinguish the kinds of content, but also the kinds of interactions that students have online. So when I introduced Whizz earlier, when I introduced this concept of virtual tutoring, I was quite keen to emphasize that it wasn't your kind of traditional model of tutoring where you have a human at the other end of Zoom. Our virtual tutoring platform is basically an online automated platform. So it's you can perhaps characterize it as a game-based environment, or at the very least, the content is intended to be very animated, very interactive, and it's certainly not intended to literally replicate human student tutoring interactions, which I think I think are very difficult to scale, for one thing, but secondly are very difficult to administer with any kind of fidelity online. So I think we have a number of competing challenges. I think if the moment we marginalize teachers, we'll slip behind on them. And so the question that always comes back to our mind at Whizz is, what does this mean for teachers? So we now have a virtual tutoring platform, and subject to being able to get students online, which is not a given in many parts of the world, even here in the UK, how can that actually support teachers through this? Because their well-being matters too. So I think what I want to quickly share with you is some of the things that we've measured, which kind of gives us the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with. And I'll get to a couple of your other points, Jason, around where the priority should be. So one of the things that we're able to do through our platform is measure students' learning. And it's an automatic byproduct of the interactions that they have with the tutoring platform. So as students go through the lessons, they're attempting questions, and the system is capturing that on a very granular basis, and then it's aggregating that, and then it will report back to parents, to teachers, and we can then ask many different questions around how students' learning is progressing. Well, one question that was on the forefront of everyone's mind last year, and continues to be, is around learning loss and the extent to which the disruptions due to COVID have impacted on students' knowledge levels. And this is just a preliminary analysis. It's based on a sample of students in the UK and the US who we were able to measure at the beginning of lockdown, the first lockdown in the UK, which was back in March of last year, seems like an age ago. We also tracked students in the US too, who were also experiencing school closures as well. And we looked at where they were in the curriculum at that point. We use a metric called Maths Age that basically quantifies their progress through the curriculum. And then we looked at where they were in the new academic year, so around September, October time. And there were 3 fairly stunning findings that came out of there. And the caveat is it's preliminary, it's still a relatively small sample, but I think it's an indication of what the bigger picture will show. So we found that if you took these samples as a whole, the overall learning levels were basically flat. But that only tells part of the story. An average will only ever tell part of the story. When we then spliced the data a little more, we saw that almost half of students, so 46%, exhibited some learning loss. So their maths age had actually reduced. That's literally the opposite of what we're intending as educators, but it's kind of to be expected. These are students that weren't able to access virtual tutoring. They weren't able to receive continued support through their schools. And we know about the summer slide. We know that that's an annual phenomenon. And so we were anticipating this, but what we perhaps didn't quite expect was that it would be such a high proportion of students affected. And then perhaps the most alarming finding of all is that when you looked at the extent of that learning loss for those 46%, it amounted to around 8 months of learning. In other words, their learning had receded. It had gone back by 8 months compared to where it was in March. So now the challenge for educators is twofold. On the one hand, you need to recover that lost learning. And on the other hand, you want to support students to progress through the curriculum. And that's why I think this concept of a stripped down curriculum is essential, because these numbers, these metrics are based on a traditional curriculum, the assumption that students are going to complete around 100 to 150 learning objectives a year. That's roughly the amount of learning that's expected in a maths curriculum. There's variation from one territory to another. Now, I know as a mathematician that some topics are really more fundamental than others. You can't really get through a maths curriculum without understanding the concept of place value and the positional number system. But there may be other aspects of number, like long division, that perhaps aren't as important. And so it might just be interesting to work within these constraints and ask, what would a streamlined curriculum look like if we had to reduce the curriculum from, let's say, 150 learning objectives a year down to, let's say, 50, what will that look like? I think it's a fascinating question. And even if the conclusion is, it can't be done, it's still a worthwhile thing to explore. Now, our data does actually break down learning loss by topic, because we assess students, or the platform assesses students on a topic by topic basis. So you can start to get a real kind of pinpoint view of where the learning loss is occurring the most. And so this may also inform your priorities. Put yourself in the position of a parent trying to put together some kind of a home learning plan. Put yourself in the shoes of a curriculum planner, a system leader. Wherever you sit in the education system, you've got to be thinking about the specifics of the curriculum and where your intervention strategies ought to focus, because you're simply not going to have the luxury of giving every topic their due attention. And so we pride ourselves on this data, not because we think this is an absolute science, but because it can be indicative of where to drive action. It can give you a sense of which topics to focus your recovery efforts on.
Junaid, I wanted to, to the point you're making about learning loss and curriculum standards, which is spot on. Teachers are expected to do not just only what would normally be happening in the classroom, but then anticipate what's going to happen for the year up and coming. And so recapturing learning loss, but also doing accelerated learning at the same time. I just wanted to kind of, I saw a question in the chat from Marielle. Marielle, would you like to come on and frame this question? If not, let's take a look at that question in Cambodia. I think it's pertinent to the point you're making. I want to just highlight that.
Yeah, I can. Well, I can address it a bit more. I guess I tried to explain to the chat. I think our main struggle here is that the government really wants the teachers to continue the teaching in the new grade, and that they decided that only once a week there can be a couple of hours available for the remedial teaching. And I was looking at Jason's remark also in the chat, that it actually shows, and I really recognize that this is really demanding new skills from teachers, because they have to be able to anticipate on a lot more diversity in their class and deal with the pressure of the government. So I'm really, I think mainly for us it's very clear that teachers lack those skills even in non-COVID times, but then now they're even more needed. So how do you catch up for something that's actually already lacking? I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, it definitely resonates. So, so we have a monthly mailer called Whizz Insights, which I hope you'll all sign up to. And there was something we shared, I think 2 months ago, where we had a sample of teachers. I don't think I'm actually allowed to name the country, but it's one of the ones that I mentioned earlier on. But let me say there was a sample of teachers there who actually went through the initial assessment on Maths Whizz as well, because they wanted to familiarize themselves with the platform, but also they were curious as to what their own knowledge levels were. And Maths Whizz gives you a way of measuring that in real detail. What we found was that you had teachers of 5th and 6th grade students whose maths age was below that of their students. And bear in mind, their students themselves were behind age-related expectations. So again, not taking the data too literally, because I never think that's a good idea, but there's definitely a trend there that's potentially quite alarming and has ramifications for where we focus professional development. We can certainly get into very progressive ideas of pedagogy and what the future of the maths curriculum should look like. I hope there's going to be some space for that a little later on. But we also need to make sure the fundamentals are there. And so often that conversation is rooted in the needs of students. We're starting to now see early signs in our data of that need also existing at the level of teachers. And so we've started to think about what a comprehensive professional development program looks like. There's going to be multiple layers, because if teachers are to exploit the potential of these kinds of technologies, they're going to need to have data literacy levels that are much higher than they currently are. And that applies across the board to all contexts. But you would think it starts with the fundamentals of having shored up their own content knowledge too. So I think there's an opportunity that as we think about intervention strategies for students and catch-up programs in the context of COVID, to not limit our thinking to students. Now, there's a tacit assumption in the work that we do at Whizz that tutoring can be a way through this. Not a silver bullet by any means, but as interventions go in education, one-to-one tutoring is really as efficacious as it comes. So many of you will know the famous Benjamin Bloom study from back in the 80s, the 2 Sigma study, which has a few caveats to it, but certainly gave a strong indication of the efficacy of one-to-one tutoring. And it largely explains why the private tutoring market is absolutely booming, and particularly during periods like this. The challenge, of course, is economies of scale. In the UK, £350 million has been earmarked for tutoring, but that's only going to last 3 months, because when you administer human tutoring at any kind of scale, you have to deal with the economic constraints very soon. And one of the visionary ideas behind virtual tutoring, when Whizz Education was founded 15 years ago, was that it brings that promise of scale. Because if you can replicate some of the most effective behaviors of a human tutor, not every aspect by any means, you're probably not going to develop that emotional connection with a student. But if you can capture some of the most effective behaviors in terms of imparting knowledge on them, giving them that granularity of feedback, which is really quite algorithmic in nature and therefore is replicable through a virtual platform, and explains much of the behavior behind Maths Whizz. Well, if you can do that, then you have the promise of scale, and then the remaining challenge, of course, is one of access. But what the last 15 years have shown us at Whizz is that the potential is there, and it can be realized through technology. What we've seen is that consistently is that students who spend 1 hour a week on virtual tutoring actually accelerate their learning to the tune of 18 months over the first year. And before, that was perhaps seen as a bit of a luxury. Like, why would you want to accelerate your learning? Unless, of course, you were in remediation and you had to catch up. And that now is the new normal. There was a press article today suggesting that all students in the UK should be set back by a year. They should just be made to redo the year. Well, what a grim conclusion that would be. What if instead we thought about how we might achieve accelerated learning as part of a new normal? And so I think we've touched on a few different requirements that might entail. And I think one of them is stripping down the curriculum. I think one is empowering teachers with both the content knowledge and the understanding of how to exploit these kinds of tools. But another is to really exploit the benefits of tutoring, because 1 hour a week isn't a huge ask once you have access. And it can invite other questions like, what will you do beyond that 1 hour? As a teacher, you're going to spend maybe 4 or 5 hours with your students in the classroom or online. If you know in that 1 hour that the foundations have been secured and that you have the ability to track your students' progress through this real-time data, what do you want to do with that data? How can you use that to enrich your instruction, to facilitate the kind of learning experiences that got you into the profession in the first place? And those of us that are passionate about mathematics and the power of mathematics, what else can we then include on top of that hour? And so I want to use that as the next prompt. If I go back to the poll, actually, let me just preface it with this. I think the reason this matters more than ever now is because I genuinely believe that the curriculum today is outdated. What you're looking at here is a very succinct timeline of calculating technologies. So starting with the pebble counting schemes from thousands of years ago, through to the slide rule, through to the pocket calculator, and that last one is just a kind of generic image of artificial intelligence. These technologies were created to liberate humans from the tedium of calculation. Humans are not very good at calculation. Even the brightest whiz kid in the world today cannot compete with a primitive calculator. And if you look at the history of mathematics as a subject, it has continually evolved to allow us to be more creative and to do higher order problem solving, and just relegating the burden, shifting the burden of calculation onto calculators. But if you look at our curriculum, it's barely moved an inch. You look at our maths curriculum today, and it's still heavily rooted in calculation and computational procedures. I've taken this quote from Conrad Wolfram, who has an entire computer-based maths curriculum, which I won't really dwell on now, but I do love this quote. He says, what the world needs today is first-rate problem solvers rather than third-rate calculators, because that's all humans will ever be, as calculators. But we can be first-rate problem solvers. This is not news to mathematicians. Mathematicians are quite used to just outsourcing the drudgery of calculation and focusing their efforts on the most creative aspects of their subject. So what I want to ask you next is, taking all this into account, considering that education for the foreseeable future is going to be about catch up, and it's going to be about accelerated recovery and accelerated learning. Considering the potential of approaches like tutoring that are scalable through virtual platforms that tell you that you only need 1 hour a week of tutoring in order to achieve those learning gains, it just feels like now is an opportune time to ask, what's missing? What's missing in terms of the pedagogy? What's missing in terms of the content? Maybe there are tools out there. And Jason, you mentioned Enrich. That's on my list that I'm going to come to in a moment. I'd love to hear from you all in terms of what you believe should be in the maths curriculum that just isn't getting airtime at the moment. Because if COVID is to have a silver lining, it might be in inspiring us to rethink the learning and teaching of mathematics. So interpret this question however you see fit, whether it's the pedagogy, the content, the tools, or some combination thereof. What's missing today?
And while folks are voting, Janae, I'm going to slip in another quick question on our last topic about lighter curriculum and engagement, looking at that rapid recovery. Really curious to hear from you and your network of partners, how that engagement's looked like with schools and Ministries of Education. The tutoring program, it seems spot on. It seems like it's that kind of flexible, adaptable model for this context and perfectly suited. But as you said, there's a dynamic where there's multiple variables and multiple actors. So I'm just curious to know, while folks are voting and we come back to this topic, what does it look like engaging with Ministries of Education? To Merel's question about expectations that Ministries of Education have for teachers, sometimes unrealistic. What's the policymaker engagement piece look like to sort of be also lockstep with the reality?
Yeah, so I think the caveat to all of this is virtual tutoring, like any other intervention, is no silver bullet, and it needs real systems thinking to think about all the components that need to be in place for this potential to be realized. I mean, that efficacy claim of an hour a week for 18 months accelerated learning is something that we've observed globally. So I feel quite confident in that claim, except that the caveat is access. If you can't get online, if you don't have a reliable internet connection, if you don't have robust enough hardware and software, then it's all a bit moot. And I think that's the recognition that kind of gives consternation to policymakers at the ministry level. So they see this data, and quite often when we show them what their data looks like in a local context, I think that's one of the lessons of the pandemic, is to be able to work with global data, but ultimately to be able to apply it and interpret it within local settings. Well, that's true of our data too. So what we've seen is that when we gather the initial data for their students, and now we're starting to see for their teachers too, I mean, putting it bluntly, it blows their socks off, because quite often it punctures their belief system. So when we show them that there's a 4-year gap, for example, between rural and urban schools in Kenya, just being able to quantify that, just being able to measure the extent to which the poverty gap impacts on learning outcomes, that is a real eye-opener, because we know those disparities exist, but there is power to numbers, and being able to, on some level, being able to quantify that. And that does invigorate intent. And the reason our projects have gotten traction is because it does then, it doesn't kind of give impetus to think about all of those dimensions that need to be in place. So it's not just about having the technology, but making sure that you have the infrastructure to be able to be able to support those schools on an ongoing basis. If the internet goes down, we need to have power generators as backups. It's also about capacity building and making sure that we're investing in the teacher workforce too, because they are ultimately the single biggest variable, the single biggest determinant of student outcomes. Even with the promise of virtual tutoring, the goal isn't to replace teachers, it's to put it in their hands and to see how they can use these tools to actually take their own learning and teaching to the next level. Well, all of that relies on having a systemic approach that involves empowering teachers, and of course this is all expensive. So there's no easy answer here, because while technology scales, the human component of actually having a presence on the ground, being there with teachers along that journey, that does incur a cost. And so I think they're the trade-offs that we're having to reckon with. But I think it's something of a false choice at the moment, because the cost to be paid, as I showed at the beginning, the cost of inaction is far graver in terms of short-term learning losses, but of course in terms of how that's going to impact on society and the economy longer term. So I think however you frame the purpose of education, whether it's in human capitalistic terms or whether it's purely just in terms of learning outcomes, it feels like there needs to be an appetite for short to medium term investment, and to recognize that this isn't just a matter of putting technology in the classroom. So I see quite a few responses have come through. What's missing in the meta curriculum? So tools to help teachers learn and update their knowledge on their own. Absolutely. I think anything that we have in mind for students, we really should think of in terms of learners and teacher. If we really espouse the idea of lifelong learning, then I actually reject the notion of student-centered learning, because I feel it inadvertently marginalizes the role of the teacher. I would describe Mathswiz as student-centered, but I would also say it's teacher-centered in as far as its potential is there for them as well. And there is a critical mass of teachers who need to shore up their content knowledge too. So that absolutely resonates. We've spoken about teacher capacity, and I think in a remote context, it's understanding how you're going to get the most out of remote tools. I strongly believe that the best way to deliver mathematics to large groups of students is not via Zoom. I'm going to hopefully mention Maths Club in a moment, and I limit that to 10 students at a time, because it's very hard to replicate group dynamics to be able to reach every individual student, certainly with the kind of focus instruction that's usually required. And that's why I think teachers need to think very deliberately about the context in which platforms like this are used. I think there can be wonderful opportunities, forums, dialogues, maybe collaborative problem solving, but in terms of core instruction, imparting knowledge and skills on students, there are frankly more effective ways to do that, virtual tutoring being among them. Clearer connection to other subjects, absolutely. Mathematics, it doesn't exist in a silo, and making it practical and very relevant. And yeah, so I mean, the truth is, the way that trigonometry is taught in school is utterly useless, because, well, the way that I've seen it predominantly taught, where it's just a litany of rehearsed procedures. But trigonometry obviously has much more depth to it. It has real world application. It has wonderful historical origins too, but much of that gets lost in the routine of the curriculum. So I think you could probably replace trigonometry with any other maths topic, and unfortunately it's been stripped down to its bare computational form in the curriculum, and I think we need to revisit that. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all experiencing with COVID this thing around the importance of presenting data with fidelity in ways that doesn't provoke panic, in ways that doesn't fuel claims of misinformation, the importance of sharing public health data in a way that is concise and digestible and provokes the right kind of action is something I think we all appreciate. Well, the same is true of any kind of data. And creativity, there's a word that doesn't often go with mathematics, but of course, mathematics is inherently creative. It all came from somewhere. Someone had to invent, or at least discover, the whole concept of numbers, of polygons, of angles, and pretty much calculus, pretty much anything else you can imagine, even trigonometry. Okay, so I'd like to, I mean, if anyone wants to come in, I'd love to hear from you. So do please continue to put your hands up if you'd like to elaborate on anything you've mentioned there. Otherwise, I guess I'll jump to the next slide just to give you some, let's just say a flavor of what I do with Maths Club. So this is a weekend Maths Club. I run it on Sunday mornings. I am thinking about how to scale, and part of my motivation for sharing this today is I really want to get more people involved. I want to talk to kindred spirits, like-minded math educators who are excited by this vision of what mathematics could be, and who really want to bring it from the fringes and make it more part of the mainstream. What you see there is just a snapshot of the type of mathematics that students do in Maths Club. So I develop short courses, micro courses, maybe 4 sessions at a time. And the idea is fairly straightforward. It's just to expose students to really deep, rich concepts, and to do it in a way that is very engaging, hopefully interactive, collaborative, and dialogue based, rather than it just being didactic and about them just consuming information. So I'm a bit of a card magician in my spare time. Turns out a lot of card tricks you can have are underpinned by mathematical principles. So I have a whole course on that, and it's just a great way of introducing students to the idea of argumentation and proof, because every card trick is really an attempt to deceive, and so it's very closely entwined with this idea of rigorous argumentation and finding flaws in an argument. And of course, it's pattern recognition too, because you're trying to link all the different chains in a particular move. Prime numbers, game theory, topology, code breaking, fractals. I could go on, platonic solids, and I'm constantly coming up with new ideas as well. A lot of these topics, by the way, I find quite challenging myself. I hadn't ever really studied game theory or the theory of knots, tying different knots. I'd never really studied them at school. It didn't come up in the curriculum. I didn't study them in my 8 years of studying mathematics at university. But I think that's a great position to be in as an educator, to actually have to learn something yourself and then figure out, how do I make that accessible to a group of 9-10-year-olds? So at the moment, this is mainly for upper primary, but I don't see why it has to be restricted to that group. And so my hope is that there'll come a point where the kind of mathematics that is practical, that is meaningful, that is inspiring, that is creative, that fosters the kind of thinking that students are going to need in the 21st century. In other words, non-routine thinking, as opposed to routine calculational skills. My real hope is that there comes a point where we don't call this recreational maths, because that's what it's called at the moment. You'll find this content in puzzle books and popular maths books. I want to see this in the mainstream of the curriculum, not just because it's fun and engaging to teach, and not just because students seem to absolutely love it, but because it's relevant to the kinds of skills that they're going to need in the future, but also it just unveils mathematics for what it is, the most powerful system of thinking that we've ever invented, that just awakens such a diverse range of thinking skills and sensibilities. So if you want to learn more about that, go to oxfordmathsclub.com and please get in touch, because I'm still a novice educator figuring things out. And this is really just an exercise in experimentation. And so I feel like there is room for a bit of everything, as Jason said earlier on. I think we can't forget about the foundations. And that's really the problem that Whizz Education is trying to solve and believes can be done with an hour a week. But who's to say with a stripped down curriculum, you can bring that down even further to maybe 30 minutes a week. But I don't want to forget about this dimension either, which is what does it mean to go deeper? What does it mean to apply that knowledge? What does it mean to go beyond the basics? What will it mean to think and thrive alongside smart machines? And I'm not the only one thinking about this. There's a number of sites that I've listed there, including Enrich, because that really is exemplary. It's enormous. There's thousands of activities there, many of which I've taken inspiration from. And they really do seem to understand what mathematical thinking is about. They actually have a number of thought pieces as well that outline their pedagogy. But there's no substitute for good mathematical content, good activities that bring about the richest pedagogies and ultimately inspire students and just teach them to think in creative ways. Enrich does it. So do all these others. Brilliant.org, Exploding Maths takes aim at a particular topic. It looks at the positional number system, the decimal system, and just does it in a very novel and actually a fairly mind-blowing way. Desmos is a graphing calculator that's actually got an incredible amount of pedagogy behind it, and Mathagon is probably my favorite secondary math resource at the moment. Incredibly visual, incredibly interactive. That's by no means an exhaustive list, but it'll hopefully give you a flavor of how different people are using technology and in different ways to promote a richer vision for mathematics. Did you want to come in, Scott?
No, I just wanted to say, if I had known you were a math magician, I would have asked you to work some magic into your presentation today. But that's fantastic.
You'll have to invite me back for that one.
We'll do an eCafe part 2, math magic.
Happy to do it.
Couldn't agree with you more on what you're saying about the need to think about kind of the joyful engagement with math. We at the Education Alliance have an initiative called Math Power. And Math Power looks just at that. How do we engage with learners, especially during the time of COVID, but also beyond COVID? What does it look like to engage with math, in terms of the learning loss? I'm really appreciative that you touched on the learning loss. I'm really appreciative that you were looking specifically at the recovery period, but thinking about that accelerated recovery now, because we're looking at what's happening during this current past year. What are the learning loss and what are the needs for learners going forward? But then the year to come, it's not just going to be this year once and done. It's going to be in the years to come some other critical issues. And I also really appreciate the engagement piece in terms of you saying that even though you have this fantastic tutoring solution, it's not a magic bullet. It's not a silver bullet. And there's humans in the equation. And quite frankly, screen time one-on-one is not going to get learners where they need to be in terms of learning objectives. So I really appreciated that. We're in our final minutes of our conversation today. To our colleagues who are in the room, please feel free to step forward if you have any other comments, questions for Junaid before we wrap up. I'll pause for a moment if anyone wants to jump in. If not, just wanted to thank you, Junaid, for the great work that you're doing as Director of Education at Whizz, and you and your colleagues are doing some really wonderful work. And again, we really enjoyed this conversation and really appreciate your contributions to this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. You'll see I gave Math Power a much-deserved plug here. Unfortunately, we didn't have much time to get into this, but I think what I love about the vision behind Math Power is that it forces us to recognize that many families, entire communities right now just don't have the privilege of access to online solutions. And one of the most powerful ways of advancing any child's learning and education is just through everyday habits and everyday activities. And I believe that's the vision that kind of undergirds Math Power. And it's something we've thought about at Whizz too, beyond the foundations of the tutor. What can we encourage students and parents, families to do in the home environment? Because mathematics is ubiquitous. You just need to look for it. And I think we need to be very proactive in that, and hopefully Math Power is going to bring much of that out.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and let me also just say thanks so much for having me. I don't think we were ever going to cover all horizons in an hour, but it's been lovely to speak with you all. Thanks so much for turning up and for participating, and definitely just stay in touch, because as I said, I'm a mathematician turned educator who's still fairly novice, just trying to figure things out, because this is, it's a pretty thorny challenge. I think this is the closest I've gotten to a framework. I think it's important that we don't pit these things against each other. We've got to find a way to recover that learning loss and help students secure the foundations, but we can't marginalize the role of going deeper and actually bringing creativity and deeper learning in as well, and ultimately making learning a habit online and offline. So please do stay in touch. I'd love to hear from all of you. And yeah, I'd love to come back. So happy to bring my deck of next time.
Just one parting shot for me. Like when I first heard of Whizz Mathematics, I was familiar with Whizz Kids, which is a charity for disabled kids, and so on. And I was thinking, well, it's not completely irrelevant, because one of the things trying to develop in Uganda a few years ago, we were trying to help review the secondary school curriculum. It all fell flat for different reasons. But one of the things they were trying to do there was rationalize and modernize the curriculum. And they're looking at sort of using low-cost learning and teaching aids and kids doing things with their hands and trying to use everyday things like stones, pebbles, bananas, etc., leaves to do biology lessons instead of just looking at a scratchy old thing on the chalkboard. And one of the lessons there was that if you design something that's inclusive, it's like now, design for learning type stuff. If you design something that can be used by people who've got maybe impaired movement or impaired eyesight and things, and they do it hands-on, it'll actually break it down into a sensible and a creative thing, which will be effective learning for other people who are fully able. So I think there's, one of the points nowadays is sort of inclusion. How do we bring these, mathematics is difficult even for many people without any impairment, and it needn't necessarily be out of reach for other people who, you don't need to simplify it for people who've got physical or other psychological difficulties necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. And it shouldn't be difficult to be inclusive, because mathematics originated with, these primitive everyday objects, and it's important not to kind of marginalize them completely. I'm thinking about some of the activities I do with my 2-year-old, and we may not use pebbles and stones, but we use equivalents. And so it shouldn't be difficult to envision activities and maybe even entire curricula that are a bit more cognizant of the limited resources and maybe the learning dispositions that different students have. And I think you're quite right. We design with those universal principles in mind, even though we might be addressing a specific subset of students, ultimately it'll be to the benefit of all.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. I think we at the Education Alliance really believe in the power of creative learning. And certainly I would encourage, I think the link was dropped into the chat for our webpage with Math Power. We're looking at encouraging folks to engage with math from tech-based uses to non-tech. That same, how can we encourage math with found objects in the home or in the classroom? And so to that end, we have a range of activities. One is an app game describer, where you can, through IVR or through other means, paper-based even, learn about a great math game that you can just collect things that are available in the home and kind of that old school way of engagement. So there's a range, there's a spectrum from tech to non-tech that we really need to explore as well. Well, Junaid, I just wanted to thank you again so much. This was such a rich discussion today, and to our participants as well. This was a wonderful exchange. We've recorded this and we'll be posting this, so if folks want to come back to it and take a look. But thanks again so much. We really appreciated this conversation today.
Thank you too. Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Take care now.
Bye-bye.